My favorite line from this passage from the Gospel of Matthew is, of all things, the conclusion, that last verse, both for its comic quality and for the line which I find to be very helpful in my own life of faith. First, the comic. Jesus said, "Have you understood all this?" They answered, "Yes." If that's not laugh out loud funny, I don't know what is. I have not met a disciple yet who could say yes to that question, "Have you understood all this?" And I don't think those disciples did either, at least if their record is any indication. To follow Jesus, at least for me, has always included a generous amount of head scratching. What on earth is this guy talking about? I'm not sure if I could ever hope to understand all of it. Sometimes I don't understand any of it. And now the helpful. Jesus said to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." Now that is an image that helps point me towards something like understanding. Our tradition is so full of both new and old. We Episcopalians love to talk about our baptismal covenant. We use it all the time, those 5 questions that shape for us what we mean when we say baptism. But those questions were pretty much drafted brand new out of whole cloth as the church prepared the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. Now, in church years, that's new. Baptism with water, of course, is very old indeed, though it's brand new every time we celebrate it again. But how do we know what of the old and what of the new to bring forth from our storehouse? What of it guides our understanding? I ask because I could not help but notice in today's first reading that Leah and Rachel were treated as Jacob's wages for 14 years of labor. Jacob was paid in women. Yikes. Something old, or perhaps not so old, that is best to left to decay in the storehouse, along with many other attitudes about women and men and children and other genders that were religiously justified. As we practiced it today before the service, we were all wondering, how can you hear that reading and say, "Thanks be to God"? You almost want to shake your head as you say it. I don't know what the Spirit is saying to God's people in this story. And that's not the only bit of our storehouse that has been, well, less than helpful, if not destructive. It wasn't too long ago at all that our storehouse was used to justify the enslavement of Africans, transported against their will, and their descendants in this country and elsewhere. You don't have to look too hard to find the use of Scripture to justify that, including from Episcopalians of that time. Of course, we know our storehouse also has both old and new that can help transform such attitudes about people as property and yield a more gospel-shaped understanding over time. Last week, we celebrated the feast of Mary Magdalene on Wednesday. We call her the apostle to the apostles because she was the one who first experienced Jesus raised. She was the first one sent by him to go tell about it. And she's accompanied by a whole host of other early Christian women who carried on that apostolic work, Phoebe and Prisca and Lydia. And those are just some of the names of the women of the New Testament that made the church go. They weren't anyone's wages, but they were equals, apostles in their own right, as we know them to be now. And though our brother Paul couldn't quite bring himself to say it in his letter to Philemon, he tread ever so closely to saying that slavery had no place at all in the household of God. Unfortunately, it just took us, many Christians anyway, another 1,800 years for us to help him reach his conclusion. So how do we know what to draw forth, whether old or new, to help shape our understanding now? And let's not pretend the coming to those new understandings is easy. Even Jesus' parables today make it tricky. We may love the image of that lovely mustard seed so small that grows so big. But that seed, which looked like many other kinds of seeds of plants that actually feed people, could get mixed in when you didn't want it. No farmer would be happy to discover that there was mustard in her crop if that's what she wasn't trying to grow, a giant, fast-growing, unhelpful plant. But that is what Jesus is saying God's reign is like. Something small and hidden that suddenly explodes into your well-tilled garden and disrupts all your plans. As for the yeast or the leaven, and how wonderful it is that Jesus here depicts God's action in the world in the everyday work of a woman managing her household. But what she was doing was tricky. Yeast in this case is not a nice packet mixed with warm water and dumped into your mixer. It is instead leftover, rotting bread dough. Think sourdough, that if you mix in enough will allow the new bread to rise. If you use too little, nothing's going to happen. If you use too much, you might give everyone food poisoning. So the reign of God is like a very skilled baker indeed, who knows just how much of her rotten dough to add to that enormous pile of flour to feed everyone. Fingers crossed. So, my fellow scribes in the reign of God, how will we come to understand and recognize God's reign at work? One thing that is clear to me is that we should not be too quick or too confident. We may plan carefully our own garden of understanding only to discover that God is at work in that plant that we were trying to avoid. And though we probably prefer to avoid the smelliness and rot of ancient leaven, we also know that decay can bring new life, and not only to bread. I have a compost bin in my backyard that reminds me every day that today's leaven, rotting garbage, yields tomorrow's fresh tomatoes. These parables are not at first what they might seem. And still, these images seem almost perfect for our current moment, both as we continue to adapt to COVID and its effect on our society, and as our interim time together begins to shift toward its end. COVID has been a terrible sort of leaven that has run through so many measures of our society's flour and revealed there a great many obstacles to anyone's nourishment, whether in the poison of racism and lack of resources that affect so many people's health and their susceptibility and exposure to this disease, or on our own society's unwillingness at times to put the well-being of the whole ahead of our individual wishes. And I don't know what you think about it, but this pandemic planted a great big mustard weed right in the middle of our progress through this interim time together. So much that it's very difficult to plan for a future, to plan to welcome someone new into a future and a church that's quite unpredictable and not well knowable. And yet from such parables read in such time come the invitation to go back to the storehouse. What treasures have we discovered here in this time? What pearls of so great a price that we wouldn't want to give them up no matter what? And as we go through our great haul of fish drawn from the lakes over time, not just now but before, which among them might best be thrown back or left on the shore? When we can gather in person again, might we decide that some things that we used to do just don't make any sense anymore? That's the job of these next weeks. I think it's actually the job of the whole Christian life. That we scribes trained in the reign of God must return again and again to the storehouse of what is new and what is old, and learn to let go of what is unhelpful or even destructive, and take up those things, both old and new, that will help us continue to discover God's reign at work among us. It is hard to know right now what we might come up with, where our search for understanding will lead us. But I know that we are eager to try. To what new understanding might this time lead us as we seek the continuing and always coming of God's presence, God's reign among us?